Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you for accepting our invitation. As you may know, today the Board of the Central Bank reduced by 25 basis points the refinancing rate, setting it at 8.5%. We'll ask Mr. Galstyan to present the communique on the monetary policy, then you'll ask questions. Good afternoon. At this meeting today, the Board of the Central Bank of Armenia decided to reduce the key policy rate, setting it at 8.5% at its session of March 13, 2024. It was reduced by 25 basis points, setting it at 8.5%. At the same time, the board let the Lombard repo facility rate at 10% and the deposit facility rate at 7%. The board agrees that a lower refinancing rate is necessary to continue to meet its price stability objective of ensuring an inflation rate of 4% over the medium term. Annual consumer price index inflation has continued to remain low at levels well below the target, registering minus 1.7% in February 23. Core inflation also continued to decrease at minus 0.4% in January. The inflationary effects on the global economy and Armenia's economy continue to considerably weaken. In Q1 2024, economic activity globally and in the key trading partner countries of Armenia continues to slow down, and annual inflation there continues to decrease. Nevertheless, the overall inflationary environment continues to remain elevated amid sustained inflationary pressures coming from the strong labor market. Key trading partner central banks would be expected to maintain a tight monetary policy stance in the near term, which could pose contractionary risks to global demand and commodity prices. Further sources of downside risk related to the global outlook and volatility in commodity prices include the impact of heightened geopolitical tensions in the Middle East on oil prices and supply chain disruptions, as well as risks of a worsening outlook for the Chinese economy. Economic activity in Armenia remained robust in the fourth quarter of 23, continuing to be driven by the high growth in the construction and trade sectors. External demand has continued to slow, but domestic demand remains relatively strong. Inflation in Armenia continues to remain low, primarily driven by contractionary policy stance conducted by the Central Bank of Armenia, the deflationary pressures from the external sector, and the implications of appreciation of the dram. At the same time, growth in labor supply has contributed to somewhat fewer imbalances between aggregate supply and aggregate demand, which was reflected in cooling wage growth, gradually declining non-traded sticky price inflation, and lower inflation expectations. In face of high uncertainty, given its commitment to achieving the price stability objective and commitment, the board considered multiple scenarios in its deliberations. On the one hand, the board discussed scenarios where possible underlying economic factors, including the potential for the inflation expectations, will remain high, as well as uncertainty about the country risk premium would require tighter policy response to the demand to re-anchor inflation expectations and meet the price stability objective mid-term. On the other hand, the board discussed scenarios where possible underlying economic developments, including a continued broad expansion of labor supply and weakening demand conditions, will generate excess supply conditions that will contribute to inflation persistently remaining at lower levels. This would imply a more rapid and sizable downward policy rate path to sustainably bring inflation to target over the medium-term horizon. In summary, balancing the aforementioned risks in both directions, the Board of Central Bank of Armenia finds it appropriate to continue to gradually ease the policy stance, the board will continue to monitor risk scenarios in the economy and stands ready to take adequate actions to ensure that the price stability objectives of 4% inflation over the medium-term horizon remains to be met. Thank you for your attention. Before moving to traditional Q&A, since we are we're at the first meeting after the introduction of new monetary policy framework, and this is the first press conference in its wake, I will ask Haik Avetisyan to submit to you details about this new framework that may be of use to you, because essentially under this new framework, information to be released to you will be much more comprehensive, will cover more ground. So Haik will make this expose, then we'll move to a Q&A. Thank you. As you may know, beginning with this new March cycle of policy, the main monetary policy development scenarios and decision making is carried out within the new framework, which has three important pillars that I'd like to reflect on now. The first is, in the past, the decisions were taken leaning on the most probable scenario of development of the economy. Well, currently the Central Bank Board ascribes more emphasis to the uncertainties and risks that may accompany those scenarios, so it goes to greater lengths to consider them, which means that hereafter our monetary policy statement alongside with the most expected scenario will include a breakdown of other scenarios that emanate from the risks and uncertainties. Another important change is the tweaks in the decision-making mechanism. The board hereafter, as I mentioned, well, in the past the decisions were taken around the most probable scenario, whereas currently it pays more attention to risks and in its decision-making attempts to manage those risks, which means that apart from the current inflation management processes, emphasis will be made on persistent policy to ensure price stability. All those possible risks that may shift the economy towards likely scenarios of deep and profound crisis will be factored in, and decisions will be made factoring in those risks rather than the most probable scenario. And the third important change, as Mr. Galstyan mentioned, is this new framework implies a higher degree of transparency in communicating the logic of monetary policy decisions taken by the central bank. Therefore, within this framework, all of the materials underlying the decision making, including the documents and scenario descriptions, will be published at more frequent intervals on the very day of taking the decision, that is, and will continue hereafter. Minutes of the board session with the observations by board members, as well as augmented down the road with the voting of the board members. Another important technicality about the change in the schedule: on the day the decision is taken, like in the past, the final decision of the board will be published at noon. Hereafter, concurrently with that, we will publish the press release, the executive monetary policy statement, that is, which will also be exposed during the press conference. The press conferences will be held hereafter at 1400 military time, and all the relevant materials will follow suit. That's it in a nutshell. Thank you. Thank you. What is the incoming workforce outflow doubts based on? Because globally the situation does not seem to be changing. Armenia remains to be one of the few countries which offers such individuals beneficial payment terms and relatively easy residence conditions. Thank you for the question. Every Wednesday in our operational meetings we regularly reflect on this issue, and our specialist observation come to affirm that this is not an acute issue as of this point in time. If we're talking incoming workforce, which includes those foreign citizens who moved to Armenia since 2022, as well as a new phenomenon which is mostly related to incoming workforce out of India. In any case, we do not see any substantial fluctuations or volatility among those two categories of workforce. So our observation comes to concur with yours. At this point in time, there are no acute trends that may be continual or regular and cause substantial concern. These are absent. Of course, we're monitoring the situation, factoring in new information all the time, which serves to adjust our viewpoints and plays a substantial role in building possible scenarios. But I have to reiterate that at this point in time, until up to very recently, whatever we observed do not allow for such significant shifts. Mr. Galstyan, in one of those scenarios, the conclusion is that the central bank could have responded more rapidly and more drastically in reducing the refinancing rate. Had it been that scenario, may we know how much lower it would have been gotten? And is it not this period of spring where customarily in Armenia the inflation is milder and would have allowed more substantial reduction in refinancing rate? This would highlight the differences between the previous and current method. Thank you. I will try, Hermiajan, to elaborate. If you look at the graph, there is market expectations lines based on the survey of the market. The market expectations about the central bank rate are represented by those dotted lines. It's the typical best scenario of the trajectory of the rate. As typical variables, the assumption is that we will have in that scenario significant shrinking of external and internal demand and other development which essentially would push the central bank to revert to more drastic action. But the most important case that have to be considered in both scenarios is that any intervention of the central bank, whether under scenario A or B for that matter, this is a multitude of scenarios from which we pick the most typical one. They are both aiming at 4% inflation. Any intervention in the monetary policy, whether it's shrinking, increasing, or keeping stable, is aiming at midterm target of 4%. As for your question about the spring season being conducive, I would like us to look further ahead, a little further ahead, rather than look at the momentary situation where we have 1.7% of inflation. Looking rather at what would transpire in Armenia in the forthcoming period, and the Central Bank Board, on the basis of its analysis and the staff input that we take as a basis, as well as building the scenarios which are based on that research, is looking ahead and aiming at the future rather than focusing on the current moment. I understand that in your question mechanical base related issues may have a significant role. So in building those scenarios, we are more proactive and are guided essentially by building scenarios around the market expectations. Mirti company. I would like to clarify how many times within a year the refinancing rate has been reviewed. Is it once a year, or as in the past, so nowadays we will be meeting 8 times a year, therefore the board will be deciding on the rate 8 times a year, so no change there. February statistics has demonstrated significant inflation in the transportation sector. According to your observations, what possible effect could it have and how long-term that may be, since it's obvious that we're not talking about the price increase in the public transportation. Have you looked at the scenarios, not short but mid-term, of public transport also hiking prices, how it will affect the gross consumption? Frankly speaking, we do not have the breakdown of February inflation yet, so it may be hypothetical, and our specialists, I assume, will concur, because it's been their opinion. It's been mostly determined by air transportation. Presumably, once we have the February breakdown by goods and services, we will be able to get a more detailed understanding of what caused the transportation inflation to some extent. As for the central bank, integrating in its decision making the possible hike in public transportation tariffs, you very well know that the central bank is guided first and foremost by demand-driven inflation phenomena management, and if it would be just a one-time supply shock, a one-off increase in prices, then the central bank policy will not be affected significantly. Of course, we should factor in the secondary effects. There may be whether there would be possible secondary effects that may result in significant or certain changes in the demand. But I think the case you have identified will not require a substantial response on our part. It will have an impact on the inflation naturally at that point in time. It cannot fail to. There will be change even if it's weighted average in the basket, which will be significant if it jumps from 100 to 300. If the increase in price will be determined by the demand, their supply effects and their demand effects. The demand effects are always in the focus of our attention. As for the supply, it's discretionary. Thank you. I apologize, I was a little late. Mr. Galstyan, look, a decision was taken to reduce by 25 basis points the policy rate, but in the communique we see that in the month of February there was 1.7% deflation. Why is the board decision and policy to reduce the rate so much cautionary and conservative? It seems that the fundamentals indicate more boldness. And secondly, in the previous communique, the Eurasian Development Bank, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned about deflationary trends in Armenia and said that in Q1 there may be a comeback to the government prescribed target indicator of the inflation trends. Is there any such trends that you observe? In Q1, I believe not. We will not get close to 4% target. We'll be quite a way apart from it, but beginning with June last year to this point, we have reduced the interest rate by 2.25% percentage points, and we're entering a zone where each subsequent step has to be better balanced and more weight. We're operating in an environment where we're part of the global framework. If in our partner countries, in particular in the United States of America, the Fed increases is within the margin of 5.25, 5.5. The Central Bank of Armenia is factoring in the risk premium that must be between the value of Armenian currency and American currency. There are multiple factors that affect this decision. Therefore, as a rule, we also work with variables that are not observable. For example, potential GDP neutral rate. Neutral rate is the rate in the event of which the economy operates at its full capacity. Our neutral rate estimates indicate that, as opposed to the past, we are getting pretty close to the level of the neutral rate. And if we are at the neutral rate, which is quite a sophisticated estimate methodologically to arrive at, we neither stimulate essentially nor contract the economy. So the purpose is to step by step exercising every caution. You were absent when I referred to the scenarios A and B. So we consider both those scenarios and reasonably approach the level which will allow to contain inflation, that is, keep it close to the target, at the same time, in as much as practicable, to see what transpires with the economy as a result of the policy we implement. Maybe somewhat a philosophical question. This side of 2022 or prior to 2022, when Armenia was planning for its budget, here's what they wrote up in the budget. If in our partner countries everything goes okay, in terms of economic growth, then in Armenia economic growth expectations may be positive, whereas now in partner countries in this way of 22 the situation has changed drastically. In Russia there was recession trends. In Europe there are serious issues. In America as well. In Armenia it was the opposite trend, high economic growth. Whereas at this point in time, and there is also inflationary pressures, of course, at this point in time when we have low inflationary situation in Armenia, even deflation on a monthly basis, in the same European region and in America, like you mentioned, the policy rate of the Fed is pretty high, and we have the opposite. In Armenia, low inflation, in those countries, high inflation. Why this transmission mechanism was disrupted? And will this divide continue to stay in place? I believe that there are several factors that have impacted the differences you mentioned. We started raising the rate much earlier than the partner countries' central banks did to begin with. We did it drastically. We did it beginning December 2020, whereas Fed or ECB or other partner country central banks at that point in time were still contemplating or had a hypothetical scenario of the inflation being transitory. This created the first part of the schism you referred to. As for the policy we are implementing currently, naturally, when we saw, and this graph is pretty interesting, the one on the right hand side, our inflationary expectations, you see that the blue line, the blue color, presents the proportion of the respondents in the population which were expecting high inflation in the country, and you see that in 21, 22, 23, also among others determined by high level of de facto inflation, about 40% of the people expected that Armenia will have continual high inflationary background. At this point in time, you see that the weight of this type of respondents is way below 20%, and the weight of those increased up to 40%, represented by the yellow, of those who have low inflationary expectations. The only constant is the gray zone, which is the people who have a great degree of uncertainty and have difficulty of coming up with a definite answer. I assume this is a natural process because the geopolitical situation and other developments in Armenia and around it should have resulted in those perceptions among the population. So I believe the answer to your question, since it's multi-layered, all of these factors have had their contribution to the difference you mentioned. There are risks that are common for everyone. In particular, if we look at the Chinese economy, even since during the most recent report, the Prime Minister said it would be good if they have 5% economic growth, and that of course naturally affects everyone significantly. China as an economy is deemed to be the biggest player, one of the biggest players in the global order. That which will transpire in the United States through these years and forthcoming years will also have significant impact on us. There are also Armenia's specific idiosyncratic risks that are determined by certain phenomena in our economy which we encountered in particular in 22-23. The influx of international visitors, shifts of the workforce, and other issues that are specific just to the Armenian economy. Is this trend going to sustain itself for much longer, or will there come a time when we will revert to the situation prior to 2022, when our economic growth will be determined by those other countries' economic growth? I will try to come up with a more macro response, since we're not that well aware of the micro motivators. There are surveys where the people respond in describing the problems they see in Armenia about their residence, transportation, and other types of issues. But if we look at it from a macro level, you will see that the 2022-23 mostly external demand driven and eventually some extent domestically driven demand that caused significant economic growth, where the disruption between the potential GDP and the demand was very high. This positive gap has significantly shrunk. Our potential has grown to a certain extent, the demand has weakened to some extent, and in this case the monetary policy enters into a normal cycle of logical response. May I insist on my question? You didn't mention how much lower the refinancing rate would have been if the board voted today not for phasing it out but more drastic, so that we realize what choice were you faced with. Erminijan, every member of the board takes individual decisions. I represent the institutional common ground of the board. They could have been members of the board who are inclined for more drastic steps. Quite naturally, I cannot answer at this point because we do not have an agreement, or I'm not eligible to now disclose how each member voted. It could have been 0.5% of a step rather than a quarter of a percentage. But through this year, true to our promise, We will also disclose each individual board member decisions alongside the common ground and the logic and the rationale that they each build into their decision, which I think will be useful for you. Do you continue to consider our Artsakh compatriots generated workforce and their involvement in the labor market, the possible impact it may have on the supply and demand? When I refer to, and I also spelled it out in the press release, in the part that pertain to the labor, we look at several factors, one of which is the issue that you just flagged. The extent to which our displaced compatriots get incorporated in the labor market of the Republic of Armenia. According to our most recent data, it's more than 11,000 people who have already been involved in formal employment out of this contingent, which naturally has its positive impact on expanding the labor market and the overall supply expansion, which, going back to the question Arshalu is asked, is contributing to the gap between the demand and supply to be eroding or closing over time. Ike has something to fill in. We need to understand here that there may be various scenarios of integration and different speeds of integration taking place. As a typical example of that, tonight we will publish the monetary policy report. There are assessments of the different impacts of that possible scenario and the macro effects and the monetary policy possible responses to that. About the Fed rate, those expectations are, according to the most recent estimate, the reduction may take place in June. To what extent does the Central Bank of Armenia policy factor that possibility in? Essentially, naturally, we have discussed, if you may remember, there was this episode when the market was replete with substantial optimism. The returns curve of the America significantly increased, although the Fed didn't speak on any reduction. Then naturally the market rates have been adjusted, and if in the past the market participants were expecting 7 to 6-fold decline in the rate through 24, the consensus expectation is threefold now, and according to the most probable scenario, June will be the first. The first meeting will be in June, whereupon the Fed may reduce the rate. Whether we factor that in? Of course, naturally we do, in our estimates and our scenario developments and in our response. For Forex denominated deposit portfolio, will it have a significant impact on the behavior of importers-exporters and the portfolio thereof in a systemic matter? Theoretically, from the UIP perspective, the answer is yes, whereas in real life, we'll have to wait and see. There is the situation that still persists. The interest on Forex deposits in Armenian commercial banks is lower than the Fed proposed rate. As to how much longer it will last and how long will the Armenian banks be able to carry on with that policy, we'll be seeing it over time. This was also determined by the essential Forex surplus in their external assets, which allowed them to be not very sensitive to be towards their rate, interest rate. Over time, of course, it will be determined by the behavior of those who entered the Armenian financial system, the external players, that is, mostly, and their behavior, that is. Mr. Galstyan, since the trend is towards reducing about the policy rate, in this respect, your main message, what is your main message to the commercial banks? Should they also adjust their rates towards reducing them? I understand that we're talking market here, and they are individually taking their decisions on their own. But in any case, what's the main message of this decision of yours for the commercial banks? If you look at the red dotted line, it's the market expectations about the rate, their opinion about the price of money, that is. And the trend is towards reduction. Whether it will translate into actions followed by adjustment of the interest there proposed, whether attracted or lent funds, we'll see. After our consistent reductions, the T-bill profitability was adjusted slightly down. So gradually, under the impact of transmission mechanisms and the impact of the competitive environment, we will observe certain adjustments in the price of money, cost of money, among the that are whether attracted or offered by the commercial banks. Mr. Galstyan, I seem to have already asked this question, but a while ago. The cash back to the pensioners, which de facto is an increase in pension. To what extent do you factor it into the demand, or a pull factor for the... We are tracking these numbers and they're dynamically growing. As of January 1 this year, the whole onus of this cashback is covered by the government. The government pays this 10% cashback. We of course consider it in the fiscal impact of it and factor it into our estimates, the fiscal dimension of it. As for the impact, it's hard for me to say something specific, but you should look at the absolute numbers. We have pensioners that take advantage of this, but there are also a significant segment of pensioners who still do not take advantage of it. We all hope that over time those people will also be integrated in these systems, will take advantage of this offer. As a result, it will form a certain demand, but we should understand whether scale-wise or magnitude-wise it will be of any significance to translate into inflation pressures. In the A type of scenario, I can't recall us having discussed that yet. This is not an issue of a magnitude to be factored into our discussions at this point in time. And about the transportation, it's common knowledge where those risks emerge from: the trade route and communications disruption in the Near East. Are you already getting signals from industry, directly or indirectly, that their clients or Armenia's clients are going to increase their transportation tariffs? Frankly speaking, we do not have yet such signals. What we analyze is mostly based on international media. analysis or episodes in particular. The Cape of Good Hope being used to circumnavigate Africa rather than the Suez Canal. At this point there is the freight price, the tariffs have increased, but there is stabilization trends already. There was recently an article about the Chinese attempting to use not only the waterways, maritime freight, but also ground transportation through Russia. We'll see, time will show. At this point in time, in our 8 type of scenarios, these are eventualities that we discuss, but not in the magnitude that we had in our previous discussions, because the risk was escalation then. At this point in time, the risks we see do exist, but the extreme escalation that could have been expected is not there. About food prices, can we assume that there is a consensual approach to this about wheat prices and vegetable oil, even if Russia introduces export restrictions over the east or export duties, Armenia as an EU country will not be affected? The current legal regulation leads us to believe that you're right, but the right-hand side graph demonstrates that the world food market developments are sensitive to this. The FAO index that in 21-22 has reached the notch of 160 at this point hovers around 115. Almost all major contributors to FAO indices, oils and sugar, cereals, dairies, meat, all of the components are going down that have a significant impact on the index. It's not only the index going down, but it's also determined by the main groups that contribute to it also going down. In the Armenian-Russian relations, certain issues getting escalated. We would like the journalists to understand the economic fallout or price of it. Has there been any analysis or estimates about its possible? Let's assume the political leadership decides to leave the CSTO. What may be the economic fallout of it? Or maybe Armenia starts to buy gas from Russia at market prices, or from food security we buy wheat elsewhere other than Russia. Do you have stress tests or consider scenarios like these? And if yes, what's your conclusion economy-wise? We participate in task forces that discuss this question. So our specialists are involved where it belongs, but I think it would be more appropriate to address the question to those who coordinate those task forces, relevant authorities. We are involved in professional platforms, but the conclusions are arrived at elsewhere, by the heads of those task forces. So those discussions with the government are underway about possible scenarios. Yes, thank you. About consumer loans dynamics, the overall situation according to your observations, does it remain stable? The increase that was largely determined or was following the mortgage loans growth, will it continue for a certain time? That is, the citizens that have taken out mortgages, the same citizens take out consumer loans for household items and furnishings, And will this persist, this factor, for quite a long time hereafter, moving the demand in consumer loans? Yes, we have acknowledged that phenomenon throughout 23. The consumer loans increased by about 24%, which is close to its historical dynamics. This year we only have indicators for 1 month, which is 2% growth over the baseline. We will still encounter that phenomenon, I believe. Talking about overheating hazard in this sector would be premature, but the fact that the construction boom would be followed by a certain increase in the consumer loans, that's a fair statement. So you look at that factor long term, not as a sporadic, rather than long term or short term, but rather than in our A-type scenarios we have talked about this phenomenon and also acknowledged that as of this point in time the phenomenon exists, but it's not out of the ordinary. We're talking about growth within reasonable limits. Within the same period, it's not only the consumer loans, but there is also the import structure of goods that are for long-term consumption. Alongside with the activity in the demand, we see that long-term used goods imports have also increased, which comes to corroborate your hypothesis. The driver of the economy is still the construction, or is there anything else that takes over its role? Our observation is construction, trade and services. Other questions? The wages overheating risks is what you talked at great length last year. Is this still a concern? Because you haven't mentioned it. Do you think those risks are of the spiral wages and prices no longer matter? In our summary of the economic situation, which we will share with you, alongside the statement of the monetary policy, there is a detailed reflection on exactly that. Let me just read out a paragraph which embodies our response to the labor. The high economic growth and gross demand, although will weaken pressures from the labor, still high. The over-tension of the labor market has weakened a little, and the growth of the wages is annual fourth quarter, 10.7% annual, determined by the increase of the demand and supply of the workforce. And since comes without saying, it's easier or more appropriate to disclose factors that determine numbers. Since you reflected on some macroeconomic indicators as estimates, do you have ranges of inflation or GDP dynamics, or maybe it's better to present the fundamentals underlying it? It would be more appropriate to talk about the underlying fundamentals, because the scenarios may differ, especially on the background of the great uncertainty we're facing. Talking about one possible scenario or development would be unrealistic. But yes, for that reason, among others, is, like I said, we will now switch to a new framework of considering several scenarios, typical scenarios, and the estimates emanating therefrom will also be exposed with relevant narratives. Tonight, the report that will be published will display all that. But these are just model scenarios. This doesn't mean we endorse their probability or that they're more expected or more important. Let's agree. Could you briefly give us a sneak preview? Which indicators do you have in mind? A certain chain of events will lead to a certain range of values. The typical A scenario is just one example of all other possibilities or other possible scenarios, which will also be included in the report. One example that is broken down there, scenario A, pertains to more long-term preservation of inflationary expectations. Arthur is mentioned. Inflation is minus 1.7, but why don't we respond faster? Even in this scenario, there are risks that this one of factors that keep the inflation low, when they phase out, risks may emerge if the inflationary expectations on demand remain high. The inflation will bounce back very rapidly. As a result, this is just one typical scenario which may assume that the central bank, as of a certain point in time, may consider also increase of the rate. That's just one scenario. There would be not much discrepancy in inflation in the short term, but demand driven, there may be 5.3% of possible increase. And the B-type scenario, which we also discussed, pertain already to, like I said, labor market. The influx of our compatriots displaced from Artsakh being integrated, migration, labor migrants from India, and the change in their incentives or repatriation thereof. All of these processes, if they accelerate or remain in place, it may result in a surplus of labor. On that background, wages and inflation will have big risks of low inflationary, and the policy rate, of course, will be more aggressive in that case and will follow the blue trajectory, presumably. Thank you. Thank you.